Good morning, and welcome to the Global Energy Institute's EnergyInnovates webinar series, where we convene experts to discuss the innovation that is driving America's energy future. Today, our focus is on methane, particularly as it relates to the oil and natural gas industry, an industry that unlocked energy resources from shale formations through innovative technologies like hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, 3D subterranean computer imaging, among others, has used that same innovative entrepreneurial approach to reduce methane emissions in its operations. Methane has a unique profile among greenhouse gases. While short-lived in the atmosphere, it's more intense than carbon dioxide. In addition, it's not a byproduct of combustion, but rather it is the product itself, providing inherent economic incentive to limit emissions. Also, at least within the energy sector, there are a relatively small number of sources on which to focus. So while innovation within the oil and natural gas industry is critical and a strong foundation on which to build, the Chamber and many in the industry also support regulation of methane emissions, thus our first speakers this morning from EPA. So for all these reasons, the level of attention to methane from government, business, and environmental stakeholders alike is no surprise. So first, we're going to hear from our sponsor, Siemens Energy, and then we'll get right to the program. So thank you again.
If the one constant in life is change, shouldn't we all change for the better? Let's champion the energy transformation. Why can't global challenges become opportunities? Let's make our ideas a reality. What if an idea became a solution for millions? Let's transform our natural resources. Shouldn't reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy be for all? Let's see people as the catalysts of real change. Isn't it time we harnessed our collective energy? Let's galvanize change in our homes and offices and industries. Because shouldn't our technology serve us today and tomorrow? Let's energize society.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and we're pleased this morning to be joined by two EPA officials, Joe Goffman, Principal Deputy Administrator, Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Air and Radiation, as well as Tomas Carbonell, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Stationary Sources in EPA's Office of Air and Radiation. Thank you, Joe and Tomas, for joining us today on this important topic, and I look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you very much, Chad. Thank you, Marty, and thanks to the sponsor and to the Chamber for putting this entire gathering together and for inviting EPA to kick it off. The one thing I want to accomplish in the very few minutes I'm going to speak is to just recognize how important it is to have your all's participation and engagement on the EPA's effort and really everyone's effort to reduce methane emissions. I'm especially grateful that that the part of the title of this program involves a cognate of the word innovation, because one of the things we're trying to promote and foster and create conducive conditions for is innovation in tackling the problem of methane emissions, in this case from the oil and gas sector. In addition to signaling that this is a key priority for the administration and for Administrator Regan, I also want to report that this has become a key priority for the international community. As many of you know, at the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow that took place a couple of weeks ago, a number of countries entered the global methane pledge. And that is as not only encouraging in and of itself, but it's a signal of how critical U.S. leadership in this area is. And one of the ways that the U.S. is exercising this leadership is not just through the proposed regulations that EPA has put forward, but it's through your all's action to make your critical contributions to reducing this very important climate pollutant. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tomas Carbonell, who has distinguished himself in his professional career, both before and during his current tenure at the EPA, in providing distinctive, if not unique, leadership in addressing the challenge of methane emissions. And he played and is continuing to play an absolutely, in fact, the absolutely critical leadership role on the team that's putting together our efforts, first to propose and eventually to finalize a set of emission standards for methane in the oil and gas sector. So, Tomas, over to you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Chad. And I also want to thank the Chamber for having us here today. As Joe indicated, the proposal that EPA issued early in November to reduce methane and other harmful air pollution from the oil and natural gas sector is a top priority for the administration, as well as for the EPA Administrator, Michael Regan. And it's no surprise that is the case. It's a crucial step in fighting climate change and protecting public health, especially in communities that are located near oil and gas facilities, which are all too often communities that are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and suffer disproportionately from poor air quality. When you look at this sector, you see on the one hand that this sector has a significant climate and public health footprint. It's the nation's largest industrial source of methane, which is driving about 1/3 of the global warming that we are now experiencing. And it's a sector that is also a leading source of volatile organic compounds that contribute to ground level ozone or smog in many parts of the country, as well as hazardous air pollutants like benzene. But when we look at this sector, we also see that it's one where there are really exciting developments and really key opportunities for reductions in this pollution. And indeed, the proposal that we issued reflects proven and cost-effective solutions that in many cases leading companies have pioneered and already deployed in the field, and that major oil and gas producing states in some cases are beginning to require. And as Joe mentioned, it also incorporates innovative technologies and creates room for the deployment of those technologies, which are enabling us to detect and resolve methane emissions more quickly and cheaply than has ever been possible before. The proposal was informed by months of extensive engagement with the public at large and with a diverse range of stakeholders, including industry and the states. And I know that many of you may have participated in the public listening sessions that we held over the summer. In roundtable meetings, you may have submitted comments to the non-regulatory docket that we created. And I just want to thank all of you who participated in that process for your input. It was really critical in putting together a proposal that we think is sensitive to the realities of the industry and reflects sort of the key developments that we've seen in this sector. I want to provide, a very high-level overview of the proposal, and then recognizing that our time is limited, I'll try to highlight maybe just a few key features, and then open some room for questions and answer. At a very high level, the proposal has really three key pieces. First, it expands and strengthens and updates emission reduction requirements that are currently on the books for both methane and VOCs from new, modified, and reconstructed sources in this sector. Second, it sets or proposes emission guidelines for states to follow in reducing methane emissions from existing sources nationwide. And then third, it proposes some technical changes and clarifications to our current rules that reflect the Congressional Review Act resolution that was passed this summer. We estimate that the proposal would significantly reduce emissions and create benefits that far outweigh the costs of compliance. First, through 2035, the proposal would significantly reduce methane emissions from this sector. We estimate that those emission reductions would be equivalent to about 920 million metric tons of CO2, which is more than the emissions of all passenger vehicles and aircraft in the United States in 2019 combined. In addition, it would achieve significant reductions in VOCs and hazardous air pollution. The benefits associated with those would amount to about $48 billion through 2035, the equivalent of about $4.5 billion a year. And that's not even including the benefits of the health related pollutants that would be reduced through this rule. Looking ahead, our goal is to issue a final rule by the end of 2022. We will have a 60-day public comment period. It's currently ongoing. It ends January 14th on this proposal. We've also held 3 public hearings, and the last day of those public hearings is actually today. It concludes this evening. And as you may have heard, one important step looking past this public comment period and on the way to a final rule is the issuance of a supplemental proposal. We indicated in the proposal that we intended to issue a supplemental proposal next year that will include the proposed regulatory text, both for new sources and the emission guidelines, and may also revisit and expand upon the proposal that we issued last month. One thing that we did in the proposal was highlight a few key types of sources, such as abandoned wells, where we didn't have enough information to propose standards, but where we are soliciting comment and may seek to incorporate emission reduction measures in the supplemental proposal. In addition, we recognize that there's some really innovative features in the proposal that we issued last month, where the public comment and input that we're receiving during this public comment period will be really important to address. And the supplemental will give us an opportunity to get those features right and incorporate that public feedback. I recognize time is short, so I do just want to highlight just a few key features that I think will be of interest to this group, and then we'll open it up for questions. First, just wanted to address a few of the key emission reduction measures that are in the proposal, and that again reflect cost-effective and proven solutions that are being deployed in the field, as well as measures that states are implementing. We do have a proposed fugitive emissions monitoring program that both includes a component that is built on proven optical gas imaging or camera-based surveys for leaks and addresses both what we think are the highest emitting well sites as well as compressor stations. But then alongside that, we have a flexible compliance option that allows companies the ability to use innovative technologies like aerial monitoring, satellites, mobile monitoring units to conduct those surveys in a highly cost-effective way. In addition, we address emissions from pneumatic controllers, which are a really significant piece of the inventory and have a zero emission standard for most parts of the country for those units for both new and existing sources. We address associated natural gas emissions for the first time by proposing to eliminate venting of associated natural gas at oil wells at new and existing sources, and to require where a sales line is available that owners and operators capture and either use or sell associated gas. And then we also have standards for liquids unloading for the first time. And in addition to that, have sort of updated and strengthened standards for a number of other sources. One thing I'll also just highlight is that for existing sources, the proposal includes both a recognition that states in many cases have their own programs, and so we create flexibility for states to utilize those programs to comply. And then we also include for each of these types of sources that I mentioned, really clear standards that states can adopt off the shelf and incorporate into plans to facilitate the planning process. So with that, I'll stop. I would love to take questions to the extent we have time. And thanks once again for the opportunity to meet with you all today.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe and Tomas, for those opening remarks. And it's a lot to unpack in a very short period of time. But thank you for those overarching remarks. Maybe just really quickly, because we are running short on time, one just high-level question. These standards focus just on the oil and gas industry. Do you folks expect EPA regulations for other sectors, livestock, manure management, landfills, et cetera?
Yeah, Chad, thanks for that question. I think, this sort of goes back to a point that Joe made. One thing that's important to keep in mind about this proposal is that it is part of a much larger administration strategy to address methane. And this is, a recognition of the administration's commitment to reducing this really kind of harmful climate pollutant and to leveraging all of this great domestic work to achieve progress at a global level in reducing this pollutant. So when you look at the administration's methane strategy, it includes multiple agencies, and it includes both voluntary and regulatory efforts. And just a few examples of ways in which that strategy addresses some of the sectors you mentioned include, within the oil and gas sector, there's of course the EPA regulatory program. There's also work that the Department of Interior and the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration are undertaking within their respective authorities to address emissions across the supply chain. Looking at landfills, there's a recognition that EPA has already taken steps to implement strengthened standards for methane from landfills, and also has important voluntary programs that we are planning to ramp up to encourage broader use of methane capture and use of that methane for energy. The Department of Agriculture is working on incentive-based voluntary programs to improve manure management and to reduce methane in other ways from the agriculture sector. And then the Department of Interior is also working on efforts to address coal mine methane. So really, the proposal that we're just discussing here is part of this much broader mosaic that does address those sectors, and again, really leverages all of the tools that are available to us in the federal government, stretching far beyond regulation to include partnerships and voluntary programs as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer. Very helpful. And again, we don't have enough time to dig into all the details. We're just scratching the surface, but we really do appreciate your time, Joe and Tomas, and appreciate your engagement on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you
once again.
Thank you very much.
Good morning. We're having Congressman McKinley join us soon. I don't see him yet. Is he?
We were on. There we are.
Oh, there you are. Great. Good morning, Congressman McKinley. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to thank you for your support of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. We know that was not an easy vote, and both the U.S. Chamber and our friends at the West Virginia Chamber greatly appreciate your support on an extremely important bill. And so much so that we decided to fly an airplane over the West Virginia football game a couple weeks ago to show our appreciation. So we hope you saw that, and thanks again.
Certainly, I saw that. I've not missed a football game in 40 years at the Mountaineer Stadium, so we were able to see that. And it was well received by the crowd.
Terrific. That's good to hear. Well, we just heard from Acting Administrator Goffman about EPA's plans to reduce methane through regulations on new and existing sources. We also know that a methane fee was included in the House-passed reconciliation bill that is now under consideration in the Senate. What are your views on these two approaches and on the challenges of methane more broadly? And how could West Virginia's growing natural gas industry be impacted?
Well, let's take them apart, I guess. And you're right, the time's short on this. I think I heard you ask essentially two questions. The first, let's deal with the natural gas tax. What I would be suggesting is that I think that this administration has to realize we're in the early stages of winter, and we're gonna see increased prices. Gas prices right now, according to EIA, are at a 7-year high across this country, 7-year high. So as a result, they've done the math, and they're suggesting that because of those higher costs, we're going to be spending about 30% more for energy this winter. That's bad enough on consumers heading into this, but then to impose a new tax on top of that at this time, that the American Gas Association is predicting that if the imposition of this new tax would actually add about 30% more cost to the consumer. So they're already paying 30-some%, and now the American Gas is at 34%. So the combination of those two is crippling to families right now. So I think the question should be on the natural is timing. the cost you're saying could be $9 billion more. We talked to a consumer, a small propane operator over in the Eastern Panhandle, West Virginia, that they're already saying that for them, propane is going to, last winter would be about $1,400 for heating for a family. And now this year, they're already predicting $2,000 on it. So then if you add this tax on top of that, it's just going to be harder for families to make ends meet. Now let's pivot to the second part of your question, which is the methane regulation. I'm very aware. I'm one of just 2 engineers in Congress that have dealt with issues like this. So I don't have a problem with imposing some form of regulation or control over our methane emissions. I think it needs to be done, but it should be done in a bipartisan fashion. And that's not what's happened right now. If you get buy-in from the Republicans on one that has hearings, we got input from it, amendments, changes, or whatever it might be on a regulation, I think you're going to have more support for it as a regulation if it's got buy-in from the Republican Party as well.
Sure. And that leads me to my next question. We know your independence and leadership as a legislator extends to energy and climate issues as well. And as a conservative Republican from a major energy state, you have made an important mark on this debate by pursuing durable bipartisan solutions. So as it pertains to methane, do you see common ground or opportunities to address methane emissions from oil and gas in a manner that makes sense for industry and the environment alike?
Well, I certainly hope we can find a bipartisan issue. I've staked my career both in the business sector and as well in Congress in working in bipartisan fashion. We're not always going to get it our own way. We just talked about the gas tax. If you just bought into that, have more people have input into it, I think we have a better shot. So I'm counting, yes, there is a bipartisan solution with this. We're seeing already in a bipartisan fashion, we're seeing Nettle working on some solutions that might be able to address this methane. Nettle happens to have a large operation in my district in Morgantown, West Virginia. And they're trying to find ways of doing some retrofit for some legacy components with it. Their technology on real-time data. I can go on. There are 3 or 4 things that right now they're working on that could be innovation, that using innovation could help solve the methane problem. We've also got a technical company, TMC2, that happens to be located in Fairmont, West Virginia. They've already used this technology on methane emissions in China, in the ports in China, and it's worked very effectively. What our office is trying to do is help coordinate that with the Homeland Security and maybe DOE back here in America to try to use that same technology of doing that. So are there chances of bipartisanship? Of course there are. And I didn't wind up being the 10th most bipartisan member of Congress. I'm so proud of my office to be able to coordinate with other offices across the Capitol so that we can get some things done. And this is one that we need to get done is somehow come up with something about this methane, because we all know the problems. We know it's either 20 to 80 times, depending upon which chart you look to, it is more dangerous as a greenhouse gas and what it's doing to our atmosphere. So let's work on it. I think we can. And I believe we can work across the aisle and come up with a solution to it. So I'm optimistic. There are enough promising technologies and innovation that already show this is going to work.
Terrific. So you touched on this a little bit, but you and fellow Republicans have been very vocal on the issue of inflation and specifically the influence of energy prices on consumers' wallets. While natural gas prices are up significantly in the U.S. over the past year, the increases here pale in comparison to the EU and China, which are faced with record high prices and potential winter supply shortages. Meanwhile, from an environmental perspective, President Biden has repeatedly asked OPEC to increase oil production, even though it is well known that most OPEC countries have significantly more methane emissions per unit of production than the U.S. How should we factor inflation, the global energy crisis, and emission disparities among energy producing nations into our strategy to address methane emissions?
Well, from a congressional standpoint, we just need to go back to where we have what maybe I'm talking down in the weeds on this thing is talking about regular order, where we have bills come before the committee. We're allowed to amend them. We have hearings. We get good testimony. We get markups. We have debate. I think it's going to come up with good solutions that where we can address this. Look, I think the realization has to be that people have to understand we were energy independent. just in 2019. We need to get back to that because I believe in my heart a lot of this inflation issue is all driven by supply. If we can get more of our supply, the natural gas into the market, you're going to see less heating costs for the winter. You're going to have more manufacturing that we can do this. So I think it's important to increase the supply, and keeping in mind that our gas that we use in America is cleaner than it is in others. Even the tar sands from Canada are very heavy in pollution. That we know that the greenhouse gases from the Russian gas is about 40% worse than they are in America. So for us to be able to do this and to reduce inflation and the impact it could have on emissions is use more American gas. It's cleaner. So the idea of being able to build our pipelines from places like West Virginia, that's the 5th highest producing gas in America, behind Texas and Oklahoma. You could go on from there, but it's one of the higher ones. To pipe that to the East Coast so that we can put LNG into ships and send it over to Europe. I think those are possibilities that where we'll see we can reduce the emissions in other countries if they would use cleaner American gas with it. So I don't agree with some of the solutions that have been proposed by this administration, trying to increase the supply by going to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, tapping 50 billion barrels. That just is a 3-day supply. That's not a solution. That might gin up your base and maybe make some people happy about that tap, but that's not the long-term answer. I think our long-term solution is going to be through innovation and increase the supply and go back to where we were as an energy independent nation, and so that we can export to other countries and export our technology to other nations so that they can improve their emission standards as well. We had a discussion this morning with Aspen about how is China going to reduce its emissions? And they said, not on their own, but if we develop in America the technology to reduce their emissions in China, perhaps using trade and other diplomacy, we might be able to get them to reduce their emissions as well.
Great. And thank you, Congressman McKinley. We're running a little short on time, but we really do appreciate you joining us here today and providing your insight.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. It's always great to hear from Congressman McKinley. I'm really pleased now to be joined by Matt Todd, who's the director of the Environmental Partnership. On full disclosure, I worked with Matt at API when the program was launched at the end of 2017. And I can't tell you how impressed I am at the progress that he and the member companies have made to act, learn, and collaborate, as the program states, to ensure responsible development. So Matt, we look forward to hearing more, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marty, for the opportunity to join you all this morning, and appreciate the ability to talk about the Environmental Partnership and, talk about what the industry is doing to address methane emissions. I certainly think the Environmental Partnership is one of those efforts. As you mentioned, this is a voluntary program. It's an industry-led program. It's made up of oil and natural gas companies that are operating in the United States. And they've all committed to the program's mission. As you mentioned, it's continuously improving their environmental performance. And we're doing that by taking action, learning about best practices and new technologies, and also fostering collaboration to responsibly develop our nation's oil and gas resources. So you mentioned we did launch the program in late 2017. At the time, we had 23 companies, but we've grown considerably over the first few years. And today we have 98 companies that are participating in the program. And they range, from the smallest to the largest production companies. We have many midstream companies that are participating in the program now, and they're operating and implementing this program across the United States in every major oil and gas basin. Collectively, they account for more than 70% of total U.S. onshore oil and gas production, and the program is now being implemented in 41 of 50 states. So we've seen tremendous growth since its launch, and that's great to see. And since its inception, we've really been focused on building, on some of the progress the industry has been making for many years in reducing our emissions. And we've really been focused, as the programs, as you mentioned, and what this morning's all about is reducing methane emissions. So what are we doing specifically in the environmental partnership? The participating companies are now implementing 6 different environmental performance programs that we've created to reduce emissions. And these are actions that the companies can take today that we believe they're cost effective, they're commercially available, and we know they achieve significant emission reductions. And when we created these programs, we also wanted to make sure we're focused on the right emission sources. So we relied heavily on EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program data to make sure that we were targeting our efforts on the highest emitting sources. Each year, the participating companies are also agreed to report into the program so we can gauge progress from year to year. And I think importantly, also use that data to inform the future of the program. So to give you a sense of, what the companies are doing, I'd like to take a few moments to talk about, and review some of the data highlights from this year's annual report. As part of our leak detection and repair program, and this was mentioned earlier, EPA's planned regulations where companies are using optical gas imaging cameras to go out and find and fix leaks. Well, the companies, as part of the environmental partnership, conducted more than 430,000 leak surveys across nearly 86,000 sites. Now, on average, that's more than 3 leak surveys conducted every minute of every day. And in total, the operators identified a leak occurrence rate of just 0.04%. So for every 2,000 component inspections that were performed, there was one that was found leaking, and then obviously promptly repaired. For our pneumatic controller program, the companies are phasing out the use of high bleed pneumatic controllers. But this is an example where the industry, I think, recognized that more can be done. So we actually expanded this program to not only address high bleed pneumatic controllers, but address all gas-driven controller types. So in addition to the nearly 1,000 high bleed pneumatic controllers that were removed from service in 2020, the companies also reported addressing, and removing more than 9,000 additional gas-driven controller types from service. So that's effectively eliminating emissions from these controllers. And they also installed more than 2,700 zero-emitting controllers. Additionally, the participants reduced emissions by monitoring more than 44,000 gas well liquid unloading events. And by monitoring those events and minimizing their duration, they're also minimizing emissions associated with that practice in our industry's operations. Those were the first 3 programs we launched the environmental partnership with, but we also, as I mentioned, have grown, and now midstream operators are implementing programs to address emissions from both compressors and pipeline blowdowns. So for these new programs to address emissions from their operations, participating companies reduced emissions on more than 2,000 compressors, and they also minimized emissions using our program to reduce emissions on more than 400 pipeline blowdown events. And finally, our latest program, there was broad recognition within the partnership and the participating companies that more can and should be done to address flaring of associated gas. So in just 1 year, from 2019 to 2020, the participating companies in our new flare management program demonstrated a 50% reduction in both flare volumes and flare intensity, even as their oil and gas production remained relatively consistent during that year. So collectively, the companies diverted 171 billion cubic feet of gas from being flared within this program, effectively mitigating 9.4 million metric tons on a CO2 equivalent basis. So on top of these actions that the companies, are taking in the field to reduce emissions, we're also helping promote the development of new emission detection technologies. And this innovation is ongoing, and the industry is fully committed to advance development of these new technologies. So through the Environmental Partnership, we've actually been collaborating since its inception with Colorado State University. They've got a fantastic facility out there called METEC. We've done a lot of great testing on some of these new detection technologies, and we just think it aligns well with the mission of the Environmental Partnership. So we've provided funding to CSU to advance the development of these new detection technologies. It allowed them to secure a grant from the Department of Energy. And we're also collaborating with them to take these new detection technologies and then test them actually in real world implementation and in the field. So I think there's just, a tremendous effort across the industry to address methane emissions. And I think there's just major shifts that are occurring, and it's going to continue. The increased use of new technologies to more efficiently find and fix leaks, and that includes, the aerial surveys that were mentioned, either, fixed wing aircraft or drones. There's new satellites that are planned that are going to help us identify methane emissions for further mitigations. The industry is even changing the way they operate and design well sites. So there's a lot more central processing. That's cutting down on equipment. That's also further reducing emissions. So on top of the new regulations that are pending that were mentioned earlier by Joe and Tomas, and there's also companies making net zero emission commitments to end routine flaring. There's new developments on identifying and demonstrating responsibly sourced gas. So I think it's just going to continue to be an interesting time for the industry. For those that working every day to meet these challenges head on. I think I'll stop there, Marty. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity to tell everyone a little bit more about the Environmental Partnership. I encourage folks to visit our website, environmentalpartnership.org. Happy to answer any questions, but certainly looking forward to the rest of the conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. And that was a really great overview of what the industry has been doing and is focused. And you got in the website, so that was one of the things I wanted to ask you. But we'll send that around to the attendees as well. So thank you again for joining us today, and best of luck with the program going forward.
Very much appreciate it. Thank you, Marty.
You bet.
Hi. Next, we're joined by Brian Miller, Vice President of Growth and Policy at Project Canary. Brian's responsible for building revenue growth, including business development, solution design, project management, and assisting customers develop comprehensive solutions to achieve their business and environmental objectives. Brian is well known in the energy policy space with over 25 years of energy sector and government experience, including with Noble Energy, BP, and in Congress. Good morning, Brian.
Hi, Christopher. Great to see you. Thanks for the opportunity. I hope everyone's doing well. Coming to you from, as I said earlier, Christopher, a balmy Denver, Colorado, where it's going to be 76 degrees today and 235 days since we've seen last snow.
Can honestly say that I'm envious. Now let's talk a little bit about Project Canary. It's part of a nascent trend of third-party independent verifiers of ESG data, much of which we just heard Matt talk about. Can you tell us a little bit about your business model and how Project Canary came to be?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're big advocates of utilizing technology, data, and transparency, which I think are three key critical factors to address methane emissions within the energy sector and really enable the long-term viability of the resource, the pipes, the plants. And so, as we see this growing consensus emerging, we started this business a handful of years ago. And, our mission is to reduce methane emissions and really work with folks in the energy sector across the supply chain to achieve their pathways to net zero. And so we really have sort of evolved into what we like to think of ourselves as is a bit of an ESG data company. When you think about where things are going with respect to regulation, the SEC, activities both at the state and federal level, really vector towards the need for more transparent data in this space. And so we are an independent third party that provides operational and emissions data, and we do that in two ways. We do it through a certification of operations. It's called our TrustWell certification. It evaluates the operational performance assessments and environmental ratings of individual wells and facilities using a robust standard scoring system that we've developed over the last couple of years. And we have a hardware application that enables us to apply that to locations and ensure that standards are met, that methane leaks are fixed and stopped promptly. And so, we're one company that does certification and emissions monitoring. There are others in this space, both on the certification and monitoring sides of the equation. But we believe that we're a real market leader in the differentiated gas space or responsibly sourced gas space, as Matt mentioned just a minute ago, because we're experts in using both the certification and the continuous monitoring to help address and identify best-in-class producers and suppliers. So I'd like to maybe just talk a little bit about certified gas or differentiated gas and how we got here. I think, as everybody knows, it's geologic natural gas that has both lower GHG emissions and certified ESG impacts. I think it's clear, and the consensus is growing that methane has a much more potent impact than on the climate than does CO2, and it's a place where we can actually achieve some real opportunities in the short term. As we've done our work across the energy sector, we have found that there are a number of preventable leaks that occur in the natural gas supply chain, and that by both producing and buying certified gas or differentiated gas, we can reduce carbon footprints today. And certified gas drives suppliers to improve their operations and reduce leaks immediately through things like continuous monitoring. And so we believe that this can be achieved with a fairly low cost of between $1 and $5 per customer per year. We've been working with a lot of utilities to perfect these data points, and feel that there's a real low cost option in this space to achieve those goals. And so, as we talk about the impact of methane, there are a number of drivers. Investors are pushing hard. The regulatory environment's evolving. Access to capital for companies is a critical factor. They need to demonstrate that the risks that they're managing, the risks they have, are being managed well. And obviously, access to differentiated markets for natural gas is something that's growing as well. And I think, just a little bit of context, as we look across the gas supply chain, there's wide variability between operations and different basins. And so we have found, and I think others will generally agree, that methane emissions on the whole are underreported because they're using static and outdated estimates and formulas. We have found that most of the methane leaks in the supply chain are actually intermittent, and they are preventable. So we believe that there are real opportunities that exist, Christopher, across the supply chain, whether it's production, gathering, processing, transmission, storage. We're working with companies all across this space to really take advantage of the opportunities that exist. And I think real-time data and quantification are needed to drive improvements in this space. So I mentioned our TrustWell certification, just a little bit about that. Think about it as
give it a second. Hopefully we didn't lose the full connection. Hey, he's back.
Did we freeze?
Yeah, we froze.
Okay.
There.
Apologies for that.
No, not a problem at all. Let me, you mentioned differentiated gas. Let me dive in just a little bit. We see the EU becoming increasingly dependent upon Russian gas, especially at a time when there's gas shortages. But this is juxtaposed against the EU's efforts to significantly reduce emissions. And so we hear about differentiated gas cargoes that certify a lower emission footprint. Given the seriousness of these EU efforts to limit emissions, how are your clients viewing new approaches such as differentiated LNG cargoes in terms of opportunities to capture new market share?
Yeah, so I think the answer broadly, Christopher, is yes, right? We've seen a number of folks, both in the European LNG markets and the Asian markets, lean in on the need to work with suppliers to produce differentiated gas. We've seen a number of deals, some of which are public, some of which aren't, where operators from the Marcellus and the Haynesville in particular are leaning in to sign long-term contracts with LNG buyers, moving volumes to Russia. And I think, it's very clear that the U.S. has the cleanest molecules across the globe, and we ought to do all that we can through the technology, the data, and the transparency to demonstrate that to the world.
Well, I appreciate that very much, Brian. Again, thank you very much for joining us today and telling us about the unique footprint of Project Canary. Wish you the best of luck and look forward to working with you in the future.
Thanks.
Now I'm excited to be joined by two great companies and two forceful voices from the oil and gas industry. Mary Street serves as BP's Senior Vice President of U.S. Communications and External Affairs, overseeing all of the company's communications, government relations, and public affairs in the United States. Mary's been with BP since 2014 and previously worked at Exelon in private law practice in the Clinton White House. We're also joined by Garrett Jackson, who's Vice President of ESG and EHS at Devon Energy, where he's responsible for leading the Devon's strategy and performance for environmental, health, safety, social, and governance issues. Garrett joined Devon in 2006 and has served as Vice President of Operations and Drilling Completions. Now, BP and Devon are both leading energy companies, but with very different footprints and approaches. BP is one of the largest multinational integrated majors with a presence in some 80 countries, tracing its roots back over a century. Devon is an independent oil and gas company operating exclusively onshore in the U.S. and can trace its 50-plus year existence back to George Mitchell, the original pioneer of America's shale revolution. Two very different footprints and business models, but both on the forefront of tackling the methane challenge. Good morning, Mary and Garrett, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Now, let's start at a high level. What are your respective corporate goals relating to methane emissions, and how did you arrive at these goals? Let's go with you first, Mary.
Great. Well, thanks for having us, and thanks to the Chamber for organizing this event today, which is, I think, critically important and comes at a opportune time. But for BP, in February of 2020, we set out a new ambition to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. And let's see, are you getting feedback at all? Sorry. Okay, I will keep going, assuming you can hear me okay. So in 2020, we set this new net zero ambition for 2050 or sooner. We're transforming from an international oil company that produces resources to an integrated energy company delivering solutions. And so what does all of this really mean? Well, within the next 10 years, we aim to be a very different kind of company. This includes a 10-fold increase in our investments in low carbon businesses to $5 billion a year. We'll reduce our oil and gas production by 40%. But very importantly, we'll still be in the oil and gas business and in particular here in the U.S. At the same time, we're developing 50 gigawatts of renewable energy, 20 times our current amount. And so for BP, we're a much different company, but still very much in the oil and gas business. And we also in 2020 announced our updated methane strategy and announced new goals for methane measurement. Just quickly, BP aims to install methane measurement technology at all major oil and gas sites by 2023. We're going to use that data to help drive a 50% reduction in our methane intensity. And we aim to achieve a 0.2% methane intensity across our global operations by 2025. So measurement is a key element of this, and it's It is, different than the current trajectory I think we have been on, but we're very much in action now. And methane regulation is going to be, I think, key to this, and we think key to the future of natural gas. So we see huge business opportunities in the methane and managing methane. And so we're already in action, but we think methane regulation is going to be critical. So I will pause there and then pass it over to my colleague from Devon.
Thanks, Mary. What can you tell us about Siemens' approach, Garrett?
Well, our journey is a little bit more recent because we recently merged with WPX Energy earlier this year. And so we've been working on methane from the Devon legacy perspective since 2019. We set our first intensity target back in 2019. So we've been working on it a little bit. But when the WPX and Devon merged earlier this year, we really had an opportunity to join two companies. And the first thing that we did was really kind of do a deep dive and due diligence on where we stood as a combined go forward company, the pro forma company. Where did we stand? And we gathered that data, put some models together about where we felt like would be an aggressive step forward, and also something that we felt like is achievable. And so we did that. And earlier this year, around mid-year, we announced what we feel like are some fairly aggressive targets to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular our methane. We set a 65% reduction target by 2030, and that's based on a 2019 baseline. And so we have set that target out. In addition to that, we set a net zero for scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050. So really kind of set a course of dramatic improvement that we're in the process of working towards and operationalizing in our business.
Thanks, Garrett. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about technology, since this is an energy innovation series. Looking at how the methane detection and methane abatement technologies evolved over the last few years, what have been the biggest technology developments for abatement and detection in your respective operations? And I guess perhaps more importantly, from a global standpoint, are these exportable technologies? Why don't we go with you first, Garrett?
Sure. So we definitely, as we've set these targets, we've been working on putting together best practices to mitigate and abate them. And technology certainly is a primary objective. It's something that we use to improve all of our operations. So it fits naturally with us trying to work on, sorry about that. It works on us trying to it works with us trying to reduce methane. And so it's a combination of us incorporating gas imaging technology at the well site, which is something that's been around for a while. But in addition to that, and has already been discussed today, trying to track and detect intermittent emissions is something that's really important. So we've been trialing continuous monitoring technologies, and there's a variety of technologies and sensors that we've been using on the well site and around the well site to detect emissions, particularly methane, as quickly as possible, and then allow us to go out and repair those basically in a real-time kind of methane by exception manner. And so we're using laser detection technology. We've also got on-site sensors, as I mentioned, and then we're also incorporating flyover data, both from aircraft and satellite data. So all of these technologies together are helping us essentially monitor and detect leaks as quickly as possible and kind of moving into a real-time detection mode. that allows us to repair those and abate them at the source in really kind of almost real time.
Thanks for that, Garrett. It's also good to see how important Devon Energy takes energy efficiency there with the auto light pop off. Mary, you already hit on some of the technological approaches that BP is taking, but from a broader vantage point, what are the biggest changes that you've seen at BP from the technological advancement over the last few years?
Well, thanks, Chris. And like Garrett, we're using multiple different technologies, and there's not one, and the technology continues to improve and develop. So this 15-year journey we've been on, we've been testing and deploying, and I think a key learning from the program is that we're going to need a multi-spatial, multi-temporal approach that's going to allow to quickly and cost-effectively find the emissions. So, and it means a layering of technologies. So it's as, this is drones, it's satellites, it's fixed devices for continuous monitoring. So, what an infrared camera might see on the ground might be a very small emission from a leaking valve. But you couple that with a drone that can help you scan the whole, a whole area, and then precise, then sort of drill down on that. And then if you move higher into the sky with satellites, that's going to help you with the bigger leak detection. So it's all of these things, and I can't say that one technology is better than the other. It really depends on so many different variables, but we think that the answer is going to be a layered approach. It's and it's also, we've got globally a rather new facility, for example, in the Middle East is going to it's going to be a very different solution there than it might be in the Permian, where you've got, multiple wells of different age and different infrastructure. So we don't think there's one answer, but we're hoping that there's flexibility in a methane regulation that allows for this layered approach and allows for new technologies to be brought in as they're continuing to be tested and deployed.
That's a great segue to my next question. We heard from Assistant Administrator Goffman earlier about the proposed regulation, and as they discussed, we haven't seen the totality of what that regulation is going to be. But outside of that particular approach, which you just addressed, Mary, what other policies might be necessary to facilitate further advancement of methane mitigation? Let's start with you, Mary.
Well, I think the regulation is going to, set the rules of the road. And again, technology is going to be critical to this, and the technologies are going to be, different, and they're going to develop over time, but it's going to be layered. But, another critical issue for, I would say, the future of natural gas, and it's flaring. And so when you think about, will this methane regulation address flaring, or will it be in a separate rule? Again, for the future of natural gas, we think it's going to be important to see some rules of the road around flaring.
That makes sense. Garrett, what about you? What policies do you think, or if any, would be?
So we definitely believe that regulation will be a part of us addressing methane, both in our sector and others. I think the key things that we would, as we participate in that process, and things that we hope for is, we think there's really important that the regulations be reasonable and also defensible. And really what we mean by that is we want them to be able to be practically put in place in a field, but also we would like them to stand up in the court system. When we have a rule that is constantly changing or caught up in the legal system, being challenged, no matter what what that looks like, that can be really confusing and hard to operationalize going forward. So we want it to be reasonable and defensible so that we can have a consistent way and kind of have some certainty in the future about what we're trying to address. So I think that's one thing that we think is important. I would agree with Mary. I think that the flexibility to incorporate technology, I think, is really important as we go through this rulemaking process. We're testing and there is a lot of effort going into developing technologies to detect and abate methane, and those are quickly evolving and getting better. And I think that as we go through regulation, it's important that we incorporate some flexibility so that as those technologies improve over time in the coming years and decade, that we're able to utilize those technologies. So we're either incentivized to do that, or at least we have the flexibility to incorporate those technologies, I think is really important. And then the last point I would make is that we would hope that regulation would include a broad look at methane. I think industry, this sector in oil and gas, we're willing to do our part, and we've demonstrated some step forward, as has been discussed earlier today. We're making progress. We've set targets to get additional progress, and that's important. But methane is a broader subject and needs to be addressed kind of holistically as well. And so we would be in favor of that also.
Thanks, Garrett. Mary, I believe you had something else to add.
Yes, I wanted to mention something about hydrogen, and you asked about other policies. And one of the things we think at BP, why methane regulation is important is, and I talked about keeping, gas in the mix for, the energy transition, but it also will unlock what I think the future in blue hydrogen. So we need gas to continue to be viable as a fuel, energy transition fuel, but blue hydrogen, we think there's a lot of potential there. So methane regulation is critical, but also some of the policies being discussed in Congress and elsewhere around hydrogen and incentivizing hydrogen, in particular blue hydrogen, are also important. So methane regulation for us goes hand in hand with building out a future for blue hydrogen.
That's a great point. And making that connection also loops back around to the differentiated gas we talked about before. Mm-hmm. And we'll definitely hear more about hydrogen in the coming days. But I think we're at our time. I want to thank Mary and Garrett both for joining us and helping our audience understand how far the ball's moved and how quickly it's moving. And with that, I thank you very much and wish you a good day.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, to close things out, I just want to thank you again for joining us. And please remember to register for our next EnergyInnovates event on Wednesday, January 19th, where we're going to examine issues around grid modernization. And again, I want to give a special thanks to our sponsors at Siemens Energy. Thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.